Greeting, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Lake Erie Yearly Meeting Annual Sessions Workshop. Today's session is being led by Matt Legge. Is that how you say it, Matt?
It's just Legge, actually.
Legge from the Canadian Friends Service Committee, who will be talking about peaceful communication skills. Matt, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to kind of explain it and maybe introduce yourself a little bit more. Thank you so much
Absolutely.
for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. So I have been working with Canadian Friends Service Committee for 10 years now, and I'm currently the communications coordinator. Previously, I've had a couple different roles at CFSC, and so one of the things that I did was wrote a book that came out in 2019, and so I'm going to be touching on a few things from that I hope will be of interest. And I'll just get started with the screen share of the presentation. So let me know, can you see that? Great. Okay. So this presentation part will be maybe about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to take questions, or we'll have some time for discussion. And then after that, we're actually going to go into breakout rooms and do some kind of interactive practice. And so if you have questions as I'm doing the presentation, feel free to just type them into the chat so you don't forget them along the way. Okay, so this is Karen Ridd. She's a university professor, she's a mother, and she's from Winnipeg, Canada. She's a part of the Quaker community there. In 1989, at the request of human rights defenders from El Salvador, Karen volunteered to go and be an unarmed civilian protector. So she was part of a group of internationals whose presence helped to keep local Salvadoran human rights defenders safe from harassment and assassination. And at some point, these volunteers were actually proving to be too much of a thorn in the side of the government. They were too effective at what they did. So the military arrested Karen and 3 others. She recalls, "I was blindfolded, handcuffed, interrogated, kept standing without food and water, and threatened with rape and mutilation." Karen had been taken to a torture center. Everyday Canadians heard about Karen's plight, and they called and they faxed their members of parliament, right? This is 1989, so fax machines, and the Salvadoran government as well. The pressure began to work. The president of El Salvador himself called the jail twice. The jail guards felt that pressure, and they decided to release Karen. She refused. Another volunteer, Marcela Rodriguez Diaz from Colombia, was in the same detention center with Karen. And she saw that her white Canadian life was being valued more than Marcela's. So she said that she would not go unless they were both set free. The guards, their questions laced with sexual innuendo, challenged me. "Do you miss us?" they asked. "Do you want us?" Karen's next choice was remarkable. In this life or death situation, where she was speaking with apparently ruthless and inhuman torturers, she put them in a bind. Karen said, "No, of course I don't want to be here, but you're soldiers. You know what solidarity is. You know that if a comrade is down or fallen in battle, you wouldn't leave them. And I can't leave my comrade. You understand." If the guards agreed with Karen, it would mean acknowledging that they were similar to her, reducing the distance and the power differential between them. But disagreeing would be shameful, admitting that they didn't care about their own comrades and would just protect themselves. The guards went silent. Then, after a long while, one of them said, "Yes, we know why you're here." Karen writes, "I had found a connection, a shared space of humanity in which the threat of violence could be confronted without alienating those involved." The guards let both Karen and her colleague Marcela go. Karen Ridd, with no guarantees of success and with her life on the line, had found a way to connect and communicate even to torturers. That's power. Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to have Karen-level skills to positively transform dysfunction and violence. She didn't get those skills out of thin air. She practiced, she role-played, she studied. This is a headline from the satirical news outlet, The Onion. It's not a real news headline. I'm just using it because just in case somebody's getting nervous, I'm not an extremist. So my work is not full of complaints or calls to just be reasonable or calls to all just be friends with each other. Disagreements and constructive conflicts are important parts of seeking peace grounded in justice. We don't need to all think alike or all just merely be nice. I want us instead to honestly discuss and test our beliefs and look at what's realistically possible in building peace. So I spent years reviewing thousands of findings from different fields like social psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience. This is an actual image of the inside of my brain. It's felt like that at times. I spent a lot of time looking into the very worst things that people do, as well as the very best. I was surprised by many things I learned in the course of this research, and not always happily surprised. But I shared what I found. And my opinions on many topics changed significantly along the way. So what I've done is to collect the best evidence-based tips I could find about peace building and constructive conflict, as well as stories like Karen's, and pull them into one book that I hope is accessible to a general audience. I don't claim to be an expert on any of these issues. I just claim that this book shares valuable and practical information from many experts. So while my name is on it, this was a community effort, and these aren't my original ideas. I'm extremely fortunate to work with a lot of wonderful friends, most of whom are volunteers and who helped provide direction and insight into this work. And I'm excited now to share with you just a few of the most fascinating findings that relate to our theme, Many Roots, One Tree. So here's a question. What's the one principal cause of entrenched conflicts? The one principal cause. Actually, it's a trick question. So psychologist Peter Coleman did a literature review, and he found that there were all of these really bright people, right? Authors on conflict, peace and conflict issues, and they were each describing that they had found and identified the one principal cause that we need to look at. When he added up all of those one principal causes, he found that there were 57 principal causes being proposed in the literature. And I think that's not wrong. Our world is actually like that. So we find ourselves here in the woods. There's this whole ecosystem of issues around us. And in keeping with our theme, there are many, many roots. In addition, you can't predict exactly how a tree will grow. The details are complex and emergent. So many factors are involved. We could talk about geopolitics, economics, identity issues, biases, technology, climate change. The list is really endless. And each of those factors influences every other factor. I regularly see articles claiming to have found the one root cause that explains a complex issue. Headlines say things like, liberals all share this mental deficit, or this is the one factor explaining support for Trump. That's clickbait. In large-scale societal problems or challenges or issues or disagreements, there's no simple linear path to define what's happening, what will happen next, or how to neatly fix it or change it. So just keep that in mind. I'm sharing just a few ideas in this brief presentation, but there are many things that I won't touch on. Many roots wind around and connect up in the end. I've chosen to focus on things that I hope will be both new to you or more less likely that you've heard them before, and also that will give you some practical tips that you can use. So that's the decision that I've made for this presentation. Okay, so let's put our detective hats on and start pondering this complex mystery of what's going on with entrenched conflicts, really bitter conflict. And I know all of us, I'm pretty good at reading minds, so I know our minds all went to the same place, Framingham, Massachusetts. I'm sure you've seen it before. This is what it looks like, town of about 67,000. So since 1948, researchers have been collecting an incredible amount of data from Framingham. People volunteer all kinds of information about themselves every few years. In 2008, a team decided to look through these piles and piles of information to see what they could find about the health, emotional well-being, and social networks of almost 5,000 people who live in Framingham. Exploring who each person was connected to every few years over a 30-year period led to a really remarkable discovery. So here's you. In untangling the webs of relationships that you have with other people, researchers found this. If your friend becomes happier, it significantly increases the likelihood that you, who may think of yourself as a totally distinct individual, will also become happier. If a friend of your friend becomes happier, someone you might have never met, your happiness increases. And even a friend of your friend affects your happiness. The effect size is not huge, but it's there. Think about that. Picture your closest friend, then imagine who their friends are, and then try to imagine the friends of those friends. The fact that those folks' happiness would impact your own is very far from our individualistic common sense. Only by 4 degrees of separation do effects of happiness stop showing up. And because this data is collected year after year, it was also possible to know that this wasn't just already happy people befriending each other. This was the same individuals having their happiness levels change because of the networks around them. So it was, or at least correlated with the networks around them. So it was basically the people were getting more and less happy, and that was spreading between people like a virus. Of course, it's not only happiness that spread this way. So one research study discovered that certain forms of depression, where pessimistic thought patterns play a major role, can hang around college dorm rooms year after year. The students who initially brought that culture, that pessimistic way of thinking into the dorm rooms, they graduate, but they've already unintentionally trained the new incoming students on how to be depressed. The researchers said it was like a lingering flu. It's been shown that decisions and behaviors spread too. For instance, whether or not to become an organ donor, to take up smoking or drinking. Aggression can spread too. One study found that people playing video games were becoming more aggressive, and that was spreading to their friends who didn't play the games. Professor Matthew Jackson shares in his book, The Human Network, taking advantage of various forms of randomization, either by chance or by researchers, there are now many examples where we see people being influenced by the decisions and experiences of those around them. From whether to go to Harvard Business School, whether to become an entrepreneur, to which apps people choose to use, to whether people enroll in a retirement plan, to whether people exercise, to which stocks they buy and sell. Research finds that what medication your doctor prescribes you may have more to do with what other doctors they're connected to socially and what those doctors are prescribing than it does to anything about the medical science on that medication. Studies into social change movements as diverse as the movement to reunify Berlin and Black Lives Matter, decades apart, find that the people who are most likely to protest in the streets aren't the angriest about the issues. They aren't even the most personally impacted by the issues. the best predictor of who will take action, like marching in the streets, is what percentage of their family and friends is also doing that. A major study on Facebook users found that rainfall directly influences the emotional content of status messages. And it also affects the status messages of friends in other cities who aren't experiencing rainfall. In other words, the researchers said that social media may magnify the intensity of global emotional synchrony. All this research is telling us that it matters greatly who we're connected to. They share information with us, they share beliefs, they share behaviors, they even share their emotions with us. All of these are forms of communication, whether verbal or not. Each of us is both vulnerable to what is being spread by other people in our networks, and we're powerful. We have the ability to serve as peace patterns and examples, to spread a positive infection, what I call in the book, the peace virus. We have an impact on people we will never meet, and that's a scientific fact. I think Karen Ridd is one good example of someone who's spreading peace. Okay, so now you're in a tough conversation. How many people think that to change your mind on a contentious issue like the death penalty, the person you're talking to would have to present you with really clear evidence? I know that I feel this way, and probably some of you do too. How many of you think that we make bad decisions because we don't have enough information? So if people only knew more, they would vote differently, for example. Unfortunately, the research finds that when we're presented with information that counters beliefs that are important to us, especially to our identities, information very often makes little difference. Many of us, when presented with this contradictory evidence, especially when it says something we really don't want to believe, we start showing brain patterns consistent with rumination and reflection on who we are as people. And those who show the most of this kind of threatened and ruminating response are also most likely to hold fast to current beliefs in the face of strong contrary evidence. As the researcher Jonas Kaplan puts it, when we feel threatened, anxious, or emotional, then we are less likely to change our minds. That may sound obvious, but we regularly ignore this in communication on difficult topics. Piles of evidence that I found all suggested that information, especially when presented in a debate style where one side wins when the other loses, is rarely influential on important issues. In fact, and this was very interesting to me, studies have found that folks on the political left and on the right both reject inconvenient evidence in strikingly similar ways. So, for example, people on the political left were randomly divided into two groups, and they were presented with what they were told was study data. The first group was told that the study had found that white men perform better than Black women at all sorts of work tasks. That first group found various severe flaws in the study and said the data needed to be rejected. The second group, seeing the same data, was told that it had found that Black women had performed far better than white men in the workplace. This group felt that the study was well done and people questioning it were being biased. So this is what people across the political spectrum we tend to do. When we like the evidence, we support it, and when we don't, we find ways to pick holes at it. So how can we use this knowledge to have the best chance of being heard? Well, if you're dealing with someone who's expressing hateful views about Muslims, for example, you don't need to get into a debate about what the Quran actually says. That's not likely your best approach. So what works? One study tested a number of different options, showing people a whole range of video clips, like a rant from the comedian John Oliver explaining why equating Islam and terrorism is so irrational and harmful. The clip, in my opinion, is factually accurate, and I also found it funny. It did absolutely nothing to reduce people's levels of misunderstanding of Islam or blaming all Muslims for bombings carried out by Daesh. This is an area where I think Quakers sometimes get it wrong. Friends frequently work in ways that suggest that a lack of information, this information deficit, is to blame for poor behavior. And yes, the information we access is very important, but it's a common mistake to think that more or better information is enough. So what works? The study did identify one strategy that worked. It's actually useful not just for addressing Islamophobia, but any hateful or inaccurate view. And it's a tip that anyone here can use. In fact, we can even use it on ourselves. I'll pause here and tell you a story first to help explain this finding, though. This is Megan Phelps Roper. She grew up in a hateful family. From the age of 5, she would regularly protest, holding signs explaining how much God hates Jews and gay people. Megan had a complete turnaround and gave up her hateful life. That meant she had to accept being shunned by her family, cast out from the safety of her social network. How did that painful transformation happen? I know you all guessed the same thing, and it's true. It was the bastion of peaceful communication, Twitter. Some people on Twitter actually began engaging with Megan respectfully and with genuine curiosity. And that approach over years, it took a long time, was to basically recognize that the other person can't be pushed. They have to go through a process of uncovering the truth in her own heart. So the curiosity asks, how did you come to believe this? Rather than prescribing, you should believe something else. Curiosity must include genuine listening. We often get mixed up and think that listening means giving in, but that's not true at all. People weren't agreeing with Megan, but they were listening. Listening with curiosity doesn't mean conceding anything. In reflecting back on her prior life, Megan explained that anyone who insulted her was easy to reject because she knew she was a righteous outsider fighting for what was good and moral, and that no one else saw or understood the truth. In other words, her group's intentions were always assumed to be good. Everyone around her thought they were doing the right thing. They knew they were harming people, of course they knew that, but they believed that that was necessary because that was God's noble cause that he had given them. This is an absolutely key point, and one that I hope you will take away and recall during any argument whatsoever. We all believe we're fighting for the right cause. When Megan engaged with people who had views different from her own, she was forced to realize that many were respectful and caring. They weren't monsters. And it became too challenging for her to maintain the firm walls she'd erected to divide the world into righteous versus evil people, ones versus zeros. Everything was messier and more complicated than she'd imagined. Since other people weren't evil, she had to examine her own beliefs and see that she wasn't so perfect and purely good. This is another key finding. One study looked at levels of support for the US bombing Syria. The finding was surprising. You might expect that which political party people voted for or their level of religious faith would predict how supportive they were of going to war. But what was a far better predictor was their level of belief that some people are just evil. That's a classic example of simple binary logic. Either you're good or you're evil. Either you're with us or against us. Binary logic can be extremely useful in some cases. Either the earth is flat or it isn't. The conspiracy theory that the earth is flat has no merit. We don't need to worry about complexity for every single question. But when applied to complex situations, simple binary thinking can be a very dangerous oversimplification. Breaking out of binary tunnel vision can be done. Evidence that I found that's cited in the book explains that there are actually programs that are helping people to do this, even in the case of former violent extremists. So here's a question. Why do people who care more about fairness cheat on tests? And this is a real finding. Studies have been done in countries from China to Turkey to Italy to Canada, and it's been found that most of us will cheat on tests a little bit. But we don't cheat as much as we can possibly get away with. That's the case even in situations where it would be very easy and very profitable to cheat. We can get paid $4 per question that we claim to have gotten right. We can take the cash out of a tray that's just sitting there unguarded, and we can shred our own answers in a shredder so that no one will ever catch us cheating, we believe. So very few of us cheat as much as we can get away with, but almost all of us cheat somewhat in these experiments across a bunch of different countries. So what's going on? Recall that if we think we're fighting for the right cause, right? So if I particularly care about fairness, then I can tell myself a story that says, that my cause is right and particularly fair. I say that question on the test was confusing. It's not fair to me that they wrote it that way. I deserve to say I got it right. Maybe that story I tell myself is perfectly reasonable. Maybe it's totally unreasonable. Doesn't matter. In any event, it's enough for me to believe that I'm a good person, to know that I have good intentions, I'm fighting for the right cause, and to allow me to cheat on that test. So that's pretty good. It turns out that most of why we behave badly isn't because we're evil, or even because we love conflict, or destructive conflict. It's because we're skilled at rationalizing our behaviors. We're skilled at telling ourselves that we're behaving well. Research into the psychology of torturers, mass murderers, people who do really horrible things has suggested that almost none of them delight in harming other people. We see that idea of purely evil, sadistic killers on TV a lot, but that's not what really happens most of the time. Instead, the evidence suggests that nearly everyone tells this story that says, what I'm doing is fair because other people do it too, because that person deserves it. Again, it may not be a good story, but what's important is that we believe it. Studies find that the vast majority of us think we're more moral than the average person. A particularly powerful version of the story starts with, because I'm a victim. Megan Phelps Roper was raised to think of her family as righteous victims of a society that sought to prevent them from standing up for the truth. Members of other hate groups I studied all seem to share this story. Even in different countries, it doesn't matter. It's a very common belief. Especially if we think of our cause as being righteous and ourselves as being victims of the harms caused by another group, it becomes very easy to justify doing whatever we want. So this victim narrative is a very important one to pay attention to anytime you see it with yourself or others. You may be thinking that the biases that we're discussing are other people's problem, but you're too clever for them. And unfortunately, people with more formal education actually show more of these biases, not fewer. So chances are, if you're very clever, you actually have a lot of these going on. This seems to be largely because the more educated people get, the more material they have to draw from to tell their stories. So whatever I want to rationalize doing, if I'm bright and creative enough, I can find some evidence that appears to support it. And I can find some ways to poke holes in the evidence I don't want to believe, as I mentioned with the study previously. So this is why more information is unlikely to change my mind. The more certain we are that we're being moral, the more firmly convinced, the more we'll rationalize harming others who oppose us. Researchers call this one the dark side of moral conviction. I think we all need to take note of it because whatever our political views, many of us, especially now, are quite certain about them. Levels of affective polarization where we feel negatively toward people who disagree with our views have been increasing in a bunch of countries, including Canada and the US in recent years. And so we're very certain about our views, but we're probably more certain than we're justified in being a lot of the time. When we feel so sure that we're fighting for the right cause, that can actually get very dangerous. Okay, so I said there was a study that found a successful way to get people to tone down their hateful views toward Muslims. And here's the finding. The fuel of the rationalization we've been talking about is ambiguity. So get people to publicly commit to a specific answer, or get them to commit to specific values to define what's fair. And do this with yourself as well. Define the rules of the game. So here's how this worked in a study. The researchers got participants to first commit to this answer to remove the ambiguity, to make it more uncomfortable or more obviously inconsistent to rationalize being Islamophobic. People were asked questions like this one. On June 17th, 2015, Dylan Roof entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church and during a prayer service killed 9 African American parishioners. Roof cited his white identity as a motivation for the attacks. How responsible do you think you are for the acts of Dylan Roof? How responsible do you think white Americans are for the acts of Dylan Roof? People said, no, I'm not responsible and you can't hold all white Americans responsible. Later, people were asked questions like this. Muniba is a Muslim who owns a small bakery in southern France. How responsible do you think Muniba is for the Paris attacks, referring to attacks that had just happened at the time of the study with Daesh claiming responsibility? When answering questions to remove the ambiguity, to define the rules of when a person can be blamed for something and when they can't, study participants were 50% less inclined to blame all Muslims for the acts of Daesh. And people were much less likely to sign an Islamophobic petition. The researchers found that a month later, those effects were still holding. Even though the study was done in Barcelona, and it happened that within that month, there was actually an attack by Daesh in Barcelona. So people could easily have become more fearful and prejudiced again. So the point is asking questions and being present with people to help them see inconsistencies in the stories that they tell themselves can often be a lot more effective than giving them new information or trying to influence them and tell them what they should think or should do. Really, this is all about human connection. It's about being a peace pattern and example, knowing that in small ways, you're influencing people who you will never even meet. It's about relating constructively, even while we strongly oppose what someone is doing. Karen Ridd demonstrated all of these qualities of active nonviolence beautifully in the story that I opened with. And I hope that you found that some inspiration and food for thought. So at this point, I will open it up for questions and discussion. I have, you can connect with me. I do all of CFSC social media, so you can connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or my email is there if you want to chat about anything afterwards. I'm happy to give talks, short ones, long ones, and we also have a 6-week-long workshop series to study the book in some depth and practice skills together. It's free, and the link is there, quakerservice.ca/register. So I'm opening it now for questions or discussion. go ahead, whoever. Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
What is DISH?
ISIS. It's also
Thank
called
you.
ISIS.
Had you said the name of the books that you compiled or where it can be purchased?
Yeah, the book is called Are We Done Fighting? The links are arewedonfighting.com. And it's, yeah, available from all kinds of different bookstores, and it's in audiobook and ebook as well.
I'm wondering if we can stop the screen share. That'd be helpful to see people's faces at this point. Thank you.
Should we just go ahead and speak?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. I wonder if there is a generality here to be considered, and that is that any and all approaches presuppose a setting of dialogue, even under the worst circumstances that you cited for Karen. There had to be dialogue between the guards and her, but you don't always find that in these situations, and it's especially not in, for instance, shall we say, street protests, where there is a great deal of noise and agitation, and you don't see dialogue taking place. I mean, people shout into microphone speakers, but that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of social change work, there's a model that talks about kind of 4 elements of social change. And so power-based work is one of them, and that would be the types of things you're mentioning, where it's you know, things that aren't involving direct dialogue so much as showing your side's power. So that could be, you know, protests, it could be boycotts, walkouts, that kind of thing. Very effective in some cases and very necessary in some cases. However, they're only one element. And so unfortunately, a lot of people don't know a lot about, you know, we don't learn about active nonviolence, right? And so we just see this model of okay, let's boycott someone or something, and we think that that's sufficient, but to have influence or to win the change that we want. But you know, trained strategists and active nonviolent change makers are using other elements as well. So the other elements are interest-based, which is where you try to find, you know, the interests of both party, which is different from their stated position. Their interest is what they're actually looking for, and try to find a way to meet that without humiliating anyone or alienating anyone, which is kind of, you know, Karen's model. So you have power-based, interest-based. Another one is compassion-based, right? So showing that you actually care about somebody is extremely important if you actually expect them to listen to you. And there's a lot of good research on this one. So there's been some really fascinating research on this thing called deep canvassing, which is where canvassers, you know, knock door to door and they have a bit of a conversation and try to identify why an issue kind of matters or would matter to someone. And it's much more effective at influencing that person than it is to come with a pre-written script and tell them why they should, you know, vote a certain way or believe a certain thing. So compassion could be all kinds of gestures, but in all sorts of conflicts, you see some people constructively showing compassion for the other side. Extremely, extremely important. And then the last one is rights-based work. And that's, you know, using legal systems and other ways to say that, you know, this is my right, and this is, you know, how it's being violated. So all of those kind of 4 different elements can be woven together. They're not mutually exclusive. So it's not to say that one is the right way to go and another is the wrong way to go. I think where a lot of us get into problems I see this on the left and in progressive circles all the time, is to kind of get into this infighting of whose technique is the right one. And it's like all of them can have a space for them, you know? So I might find, let's just say, I've talked to people like this, right? Who are like, I'm really concerned about the environment, but I'm upset with Greta Thunberg because she's too aggressive, right? But you know, there's a space for the aggressive activist, and then there's also a space for the person who wants to engage in dialogue, and they don't have to be mutually harming each other. They can actually be mutually beneficial. So this is the kind of dance, and I'm not an activist strategist at all, but you know, when you see really brilliant strategists who are able to win social change, they're navigating and bringing together all of these different elements rather than infighting with each other. Bill.
I was fascinated by your talk about the sort of the peace virus and this idea that we can spread, you know, pessimism or hope. One of my areas of work over the years has been creating mediation services at college and university campuses. So you can have spaces where people can come together to solve conflict at a university. And at Carleton University in Canada, they set up a mediation service that served in the community and on campus. And they did there was a master's student there who did a research project, and she studied the work of the center. And she discovered that the biggest effect that they had was that all of these volunteers who were trained as mediators took that skill and spread it into their families and their friends and their neighborhood. And it was like, the impact was not, it was on the people who had the fight that they were mediating, but it was also this culture change that was happening with all these people who were learning this new set of skills. So she called it the peace virus in her paper. And I think it was really a smart idea.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very much what we're trying to contribute to at CFSC with this work as well. Yeah, that's a great example.
Do you, in your book or in your work with communities, have particular exercises and recommendations to help get past our fear, anxiety, frustration, anger, to looking for interest and compassion as a way to connect?
Yeah. This is a great question. I think the tools that we look at in the book and the workshops are a little bit related to nonviolent communication. So I think that's maybe one of the most effective ones that I've come across. But basically, you need a container for those emotions, right? If the emotions are in people, you can't just say, let's get past them. You need some container for them. So you need to have a space, maybe like what Bill was talking about, some kind of program or space where people can come together and have this this dialogue, and not have it be a debate about you know, one side battling for supremacy, but really listen to each other at a simpler level. So what I really recommend is taking it back to this simpler level. And that's where I think nonviolent communication is quite a wonderful set of techniques. Because I think many of us are too smart these days, or too clever. And what I see is a lot of diagnoses. There's so many that you can, you know, 10 signs that my partner is a secret narcissist, you know, 7 ways to tell if this person is gaslighting me, all these kind of things. And so we have so many labels that we can put on people and diagnose them. And that can be useful to an extent. I'm not fully rejecting that at all. But I think often if we want to actually, if we do want to have a positive relationship with someone, it can be very useful to try to just get to a simpler level. So leave the diagnosis and all of that stuff to one side and try to figure out what is the person feeling and what do they need. And feelings and needs are very basic and very universal. So if you can get to the level of you say to the person, I hear that you feel this because you need this, and they say, yes, that's exactly what I feel, that's exactly what I need, you got it right, you're going to have a good conversation. You're going to be able to move forward. And similarly, you need to be able to find your own feeling and your own need, and stay away from the level of you did this and that, right? So I feel that you need to be smarter is not a feeling, right? I feel, you know, frustrated right now because I need to feel understood, and I'm not feeling understood. So can I keep communicating? Can I hear what you heard me say? I'd like to make sure that you understood me. That's a feeling, that's a need. So it's a lot more basic, actually. It's not so analytical. Another really fascinating thing on that is that cross-culturally, I was able to look at a bunch of studies from many different cultures, indigenous cultures in a bunch of different parts of the world. You know, we're very odd in many ways, that we like to look at, you know, we like to get into our heads. We like analysis. A lot of cultures don't go that way. So when there's conflicts in a lot of parts of the world, they try to transform the energy that conflict has generated into a positive direction. So that might be through, you know, shared singing together, or dancing, or sitting and listening to a parable from an elder that doesn't talk directly about who did what to whom, but, you know, shares a message and helps reorient the conflicted parties. These kind of things, like, for instance, there's a lot of evidence on the neuroscience of it, and you know, shared singing, when you sing together with someone, your brains actually start, you know, being more in sync, basically. So it's very powerful, it's very ancient, and it doesn't have to always be about kind of legalistically breaking down who did what to whom and who deserves what in this very analytical way of being. I hope that's sort of answered your question.
Thank you.
Matt, I'm as aware as you that there's a great time sink in not taking on some of these techniques and just being stuck in conflict. But I'm wondering if you can speak to frustration of people who feel that these techniques are a dodge for something that needs to be done urgently, that there's an urgency that demands action, and that this is really us trying not to act.
Yeah, great question. So, you know, urgency has always been there and will always be there. And I certainly agree with it. I mean, for instance, you know, climate change is an urgent crisis. The evidence that I was able to find to suggest that somehow more extreme or more aggressive techniques are more likely to succeed was minimal. It's not really there. So, you know, there's good evidence, or quite a bit of it, that, you know, more destructive tactics, like, for instance, breaking shop windows to try to get your point across, doesn't get your point across. It causes polarization. So it causes people who already agree with your point to agree even more fervently with your point. And it causes people who are in the margins and unsure to distance themselves from you because now they find you too extreme. And that's been found in a bunch of places. There was recently a real-time example in a protest movement in Barcelona, et cetera. So I think there's pretty good evidence for that. So basically the point is, when people are in this state of, I don't want to listen, I don't want to engage the other side, I just want to force them to do what I want them to do. Sometimes it can work. I'm not saying it never works at all, but it often will only work partially, and it won't address the conditions for why there's that disagreement. So it's also more likely to cause backlash. And so then, you know, the situation continues indefinitely and just gets uglier and uglier because the other side tends to escalate. Especially people across the spectrum, wherever you are in any country, people don't like feeling humiliated. So if you really force something on someone and they feel like you've humiliated them, there's some evidence that they will even be happy to retaliate on you in a way that even harms them. So it's like, I don't mind that this social policy is going to actually hurt me, as long as it hurts you more, just to prove to you, then I'm going to support it, right? So this is what I think some of the dynamics that we're seeing right now in a lot of countries here in Canada and the US with extreme polarization on some issues. And so the way one of the ways out, I think, is more listening and more compassion-based work, but it's not, listening again is not about not holding people accountable. It's not about agreeing with them. So that's the important distinction. Did that say enough, or do you want to?
Yes, that's super great. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Matt, would you say more about what you were just saying? Now I've lost it. About not disagreeing. I'm sorry, I've lost it now. You had said something right at the end, right before Susan answered your question. And
Not humiliating.
Not humiliating?
It's not about agreeing with them. It's not about not holding them accountable.
Was that what you were talking about, Pat?
I'm not, it doesn't seem like, I mean, there were all those things, but it was, so while you're trying to, I think it was compassion based, while you're trying to go deeper into compassion, and some people are saying, this is just putting this off. We want a decision in this matter. That there's a problem of, a disagreement in your meeting. And people keep coming back to, well, we need to see it more deeply. We need to have more compassion for one another. We need to find other ways of talking to one another. But it goes on. And then finally somebody says, but we never actually do that. And then somebody finally says, we just need to make a decision. Forcing it. Somebody's got to do something.
Yeah, so thank you. So I think the idea of basically using processes of dialogue and et cetera to just oppress or to just, not have a conversation to avoid, that can definitely happen. And so, power differentials need to be taken into very careful consideration when using any of these techniques. This is why, again, there's brilliant nonviolent strategists who think these things through and figure out who the right targets are for their actions and what the right actions are at the right times. And I have huge respect for that. That is very difficult. And, we only see the stuff that's on TV or the big actions in the streets, but activists will tell you that's maybe 2% of their time, right? 98% is organizing people together and networking and strategizing. So yes, and at the monthly meeting level or something like that, processes could be used to just delay a decision inappropriately in a long manner, and that there should be a process for that. But yes, unfortunately, if you force a decision through before it's ready, it also is going to have blowback more often than not because people don't like feeling forced and coerced and humiliated. I saw Erica and then David. Are you there, Erica? Okay, maybe, oh yes. You're muted, Erica.
I apologize for that. One of my kids just called me. Did you do a program on communication at the Kalamazoo meeting a couple years ago, do you think, Matt?
No.
Okay. I was just wondering what kind of, if you have some programs you recommend or things we can do in our meetings or our groups that might be helpful. And I apologize if you said this already. I didn't connect until later.
Oh yeah, no problem. So the things I would recommend, if you really want to do like a dive on communication, we're going to practice it in a couple minutes, but try concentric circles. So we'll get into that practice. Another thing you can do like more than that is nonviolent communication. And then I also, CFSC has a resource that we've produced on conflict within meetings specifically. So I can also link to that in the chat. So those are the things that come to mind.
Matt, could you tell us about the workshop that is offered through Canadian Friends Service Committee and how that works? It's over several weeks. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's 6 weeks long. It's based on the book. And so each week there's maybe 20 to 30 pages of reading, and then there's group discussion, and then we do practice activities. And the activity we're going to do later, the concentric circles, is one that we do, but it's over 6 weeks, so we have more time to develop things. And the nice thing is it's in a group. So every single time it's totally different. I don't know how it's going to go. It depends what interests the group members have and what stories they bring and stuff like that. And so you do get to feel kind of closer to the group and interact with people over a bit longer period. And I'm happy to do that as well for monthly meetings. So if your meeting is interested in a workshop group for the meeting, I have done that for a few Quaker meetings before. Okay, David.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that listening can be misused, and another form of conflict avoidance rather than conflict processing. I'm remembering some report of studies in the 1950s and into the 60s, particularly in the South, but not exclusively there, that every time there was a racial crisis, the mayor usually would call together, quote, a biracial commission. You know, 2 or 3 members from white and black, respected folks. And it was just a way of avoiding dealing with the injustices of, oh yeah, we're taking care of that. We have a biracial commission. And it was institutionalized dodging. And it really, I mean, maybe they communicated there, but it had nothing to do with policy change. And my generation, and I was glad to see that Diane Nash was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom a couple of weeks ago. Those folks, after a whole year of nonviolence training that Reverend Jim Lawson gave them in Nashville, they started marching, silent marches, right up to the mayor. And there's this wonderful scene of Diane and the mayor, what are you gonna do? This is what's needed. So it was very public communication at that point, and it led to the mayor saying, oh, okay, I'm going to work for a non-discrimination ordinance. But there's communication. There's a lot of ways of communication, and you've said that. But there's ways in which the illusion of communication can be deadly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Diane Nash and the Lunchville counter sit-ins is one of the stories that's in the book. I think it's a really remarkable story that's also told in a film. What can I say about it? I think it's a combination of those 4 elements, right? So they use the element of power, but they also use the element of rights, and they used the element of interest, and they showed compassion in strategic ways in the right moments. So they did it all. And it still was only one part, and it still took time. And even though there was this urgency, they didn't get everything they wanted right away by any means. And still to this day, there's a lot of systemic problems that haven't been addressed, right? So it's an ongoing struggle. And that's, I think, what we find in pretty much all social change work, is that it's always going to be messy and imperfect. But yes, power differentials need to be really carefully considered in those kind of things. There was another question, but I see the hand went down, so maybe we'll go to our activity now. I'm going to screen share again. Yes. I'm going to screen share again just to introduce this quickly, and then I will give instructions about the activity itself. So this is a bit more about kind of communication technique right now. And so there we go. So first, it's important to know that we're always communicating, right? Whether you like it or not, you're communicating. So your body language communicates, your facial expressions communicate, your words and your tone communicates, but even your silence communicates. So as we go about our lives communicating with each other, Tensions arise when we aren't clear on what's being communicated or when we have different needs or different plans than other people. So we want the meeting room carpet to be a certain color and style, and another friend thinks equally strongly that it should be something different. The tensions, disagreements, and conflicts that arise are not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. And they're definitely not a sign of a failing. And sometimes Quakers in particular can feel like they are, because they feel like peace means just getting along all the time. So I want to dispel us of that notion. Conflicts can be creative and enriching, and they can also get stuck or expand into serious problems over time. So how we navigate these issues through communication make all the difference. So this is a simple tool for those of us who do like to be more analytical, called the Thomas Kilmann instrument. It's in chapter 9 of the book, or you can search Thomas Kilmann instrument if you want to find it online. So if we care a lot about getting our own way, we can call that assertiveness. That's on the y-axis. And if we care a lot about our relationships with other people, we can call that one cooperativeness. So that's on the x-axis. Okay, so if you care a lot about relationships with the other person and you don't care a lot about the carpet color being the one that you prefer, then you'll just avoid communicating further on the topic. You just won't say anything about it. If you care a lot about the carpet color and not much about your relationship with the other person, then you're going to be directing. So then you're firmly telling everybody that the carpet color has to be the way that that you think it is, even if it upsets them. If we care a lot about relationships and not much about the carpet color, then we're accommodating. So in this case, we are communicating with the person because we care about relationship with them, but we're just not going to mention and keep quiet about our own conflicting needs and ideas. If we care a lot about relationships and we care a lot about our own ideas and needs, then we're collaborating. So that's the one where we're trying to understand their needs, our own needs, and work together for a win-win solution. And somewhere in the middle is compromise. So in this case, that might mean picking another color that was no one's first choice, but that everyone can live with. Something to notice is that none of these styles is the right way to communicate or to be in disagreement. So collaborating takes time, it can be slow, maybe you won't get there. It's not always the best thing to do. And the same with any of the other conflict styles. Very importantly, being self-sacrificing and accommodating, just going along with what others want, is not automatically ethical. It can breed silent resentment, and it may result in worse quality decisions being taken because you didn't speak up. You kept your truth from the group. Similarly, reaching a quick compromise isn't necessarily moral. It means that someone wins a bit, but also loses a bit. Everyone does. And in many cases, more communication might have uncovered a way forward that was win-win, but that no one had thought of yet. So as Quakerism emphasizes, decision-making processes, that is how a decision is reached, and in particular, the process of reaching unity in the spirit, can be extremely powerful, even if the process can be demanding of time, energy, and worshipful attention. These processes also require peaceful and clear communication skills. So we're going to do a bit of practice with that. I think we wouldn't be here if we didn't believe in respecting one another. So first and foremost in this activity, please be respectful of others. Part of respecting everyone here is taking their privacy seriously. And so please consider, not sharing anything that is said here outside of this. Please consider it confidential. So no posts on social media later, no sharing afterwards what someone said without getting their permission first. Can we agree to that with a thumbs up or something? Thank you. How much you choose to give to this exercise is going to determine how much you get out of it. So I want to stress that, so I'll say it again. You will get the most from this if you give more to it. That means trying to minimize distractions so as to stay fully present. Being present is a huge part of effective communication. I know it's really tough on computers because there's different distractions and things popping up to try to grab your attention, but do your best to stay here. Giving the most to this session also means trying to push yourself a bit out of your comfort zone. So that place of some unfamiliarity and maybe even some discomfort is where the most rewarding learning happens. You wouldn't have any of the wonderful skills that you have if it weren't for periods of some challenge while you were learning. So consider if you can push yourself a bit out of your comfort zone. But if you feel that something is too much and you can't participate, just listen to yourself. So the exercise we'll be doing is called concentric circles. And this is much easier in person, but hopefully it's going to work for us all online. We'll see. I'm going to randomly assign you to a breakout room with one other person in it. So you'll be in a 2-person breakout room. I'll also be closing the breakout room when the exercise is done, so you don't need to leave the breakout room. The person whose first name comes first in the alphabet, so if your name comes first in the alphabet, you're the listener in the first go. The other person is the speaker. In a moment, I'm going to read out 2 questions. Speakers, you'll choose one of those 2 questions, and that will be the one that you will answer. Speakers will only answer one of the questions. Susan.
Yeah, sorry, didn't want to interrupt, but just how do we manage it when there's 2 people in one screen?
2 people on one screen.
There's like several couples that are here together. So
Oh,
it's 3
right,
people
right.
in a Zoom breakout.
Right. I think then someone will have to observe if you're 2 people sharing a screen. Thanks for that. So speakers have the freedom to express themselves without being interrupted or attacked. Speakers practice being clear and precise with their words. Try to give specific examples of what you mean. Try to identify and express your feelings or emotions related to the topic. I'd also encourage you to try not to focus on judging or punishing. So that's the speaker role. After 2 minutes, I'll send a message that the speaker's time is up. The listener will then have 1 minute to summarize only what they heard. Summarizing is an important skill. It means choosing key points without putting words into the speaker's mouth. The speaker can use this as an opportunity when they're hearing reflected back what they said to discover how their message was heard and if there are areas that were unclear. So listeners, you're repeating back only what you've heard the speaker say, not adding your own ideas or not adding any evaluations. The listener may ask questions for clarification only if necessary, not to cut the speaker off or to challenge what they're saying. A bunch of us like to jump in to offer advice or solutions to other people's problems commonly, but that isn't always welcome. So this is a good exercise to help listeners practice remaining present while not taking control of a conversation. You're not trying to fix the issues raised. It's really difficult on Zoom, but listeners, please do your best to practice other elements of active listening as well. So try to practice engaged body language, eye contact, and demonstrating to the speaker that you're present to what's being said. One thing you can do, if you can, is to try to have your camera turned on and as close to your eye level as possible. After 1 minute of the listener summarizing, you'll get another message from me to switch roles. Again, the new speakers will choose just one of the 2 questions and speak to that. And then I will send another message and the listeners will summarize what they heard for 1 minute. After that, the first round is going to be done. I'll close the breakout rooms. You'll come back here. I'll give you new questions and I'll send you to breakout rooms again with somebody new. And so does that make sense what we're doing? Go ahead, Susan. You're muted. You're muted, Susan.
Did I hear right that the listener may ask for clarification during the conversation or just say that
If you really
afterward.
need to, but I would keep it to a minimum. Try to
Okay.
avoid it if you can.
Thank
Yeah. Thanks. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Does the speaker, did you say it was 2 minutes for the
Yeah.
speaker?
The speaker will have 2 minutes, and I will send a message. So you don't need to time it. I'll let you
Okay.
know when the time's up. Yeah. Okay. So the questions. Go ahead, David.
At the very beginning, you said something about the alphabetical order of the first name, but what role
Yeah.
was
So
that?
if your first name comes first in the alphabet, then you're the listener first, just so
Listener.
that we
Thank
have
you.
a sense. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Okay. So the questions for round one. What was one toy or object that you treasured as a child? What was one toy or object that you treasured as a child? Or if you want to answer a different question, you have a friend visiting and it's their first time in your city or town. What's one place you would make sure to take them to and why? You have a friend visiting and it's their first time in your city or town. What's one place you would make sure to take them to and why? I'm going to create the breakout room.
We didn't see the 2 minutes.
You didn't see the 2 minutes?
No, so we didn't have time for feedback.
The timing was all off.
Yeah, I sent messages at all of the times, so you should have seen a message that said, listeners, please listeners, please summarize, and then another one, switch roles.
On my
No.
computer, it was a tiny little box way at the top of the screen, and it was. and
Oh,
it
yeah?
was
Okay.
The second one, it was very small.
I saw
Okay.
a whole line of speeches at the top of the.
Round two, we should use our phones. Lesson learned.
Okay, so it may be different for different people's Zoom. If you're using it on a different version or a different device, maybe that makes a difference. I'm not sure. Okay, so round two. What are your particular strengths? What are your particular strengths? Or if you want to answer a different question, how do you use your strengths to build peace? How do you use your strengths to build peace?